Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining on another All Things Avennia. My name is Eli. I'm your host, and we are in week 2 of Washington Wine Month, of Taste Washington Month, of all things Washington. So today I thought we would go over a look at some of the pioneers of the wine industry in Washington. That's both going to be the founding pioneers, the original people who were planting vines and progressing the wine industry here in Washington, but also some current pioneers, people who are doing some really interesting things now, and take a look at some of their projects and whatnot. So we are going to just dive right in to our slideshow. I'm going to share my screen, and we will go from there. So here we have Washington wine pioneers, from the founders through the 21st century. So it all began back way before Washington was an official state of the Union. It was a territory for a long time, and was really a base of fur trappers and explorers. You had people from the Oregon Trail coming and exploring and setting up in Washington. But the very first grapes, the first vines, were planted at Fort Vancouver. So this was at Vancouver, Washington, not Vancouver, Canada, for those who are wondering. And this is in 1825. So Hudson Bay Company it's a very old company, originated in Britain, and then a Canadian company. It's still around today. It's actually the company that owns Saks Fifth Avenue retail shop. But they were a big fur trader company back in the 19th century. And they were the ones to plant vines. And that's a painting or a drawing of that settlement. Throughout the 50s, you had more and more homesteaders, again, on the Oregon Trail, who were bringing vines and planting vines along the route in eastern Washington. Our first hybrid varieties, so the first time we saw some of those vinifera hybrids arriving in Puget Sound, was in the 1850s as well. And then you had a lot of immigrants, a lot of Italian immigrants, German immigrants, who were planting vines. The 1860 was when the first vines were planted in Walla Walla Valley. There was a French immigrant named Charles Chateau in 1869 who planted cuttings from the Hudson Bay Company, so from Fort Vancouver. He planted those in Yakima Valley. And one of the cool little stories I found was in 1872, you had this man, Lambert Evans. Lambert Evans was actually a Confederate soldier from the Civil War who was imprisoned in St. Louis and then released after the war. He walked to California and eventually made his way north to Washington and set up on a place called Stretch Island. So this is just northeast of Olympia on the Puget Sound. And he planted some vines there. And actually the oldest living vine that we can find currently in Washington is one of those vines that he planted on Stretch Island. So it dates back to 1872. And then the first official winery in the state was in 1874 in East Wenatchee. And this is all pre-statehood. So Washington then didn't become a state until 1889. And then we get to the times right before Prohibition. So during this time, there were vines being planted all over. Still, most of them were for eating or for juice or table grapes, so Concord grapes and other Labrusca varieties. It wasn't necessarily being made into wine on a grand scale, if anything, just for home purposes. In 1903 is when you saw a big influx in research into irrigation. So they began with especially furrow irrigation, which is basically trapping or redirecting snow melt from the Cascades into the desert in eastern Washington and utilizing that in vineyards. In a similar way they're doing down in the Andes in Argentina. And that really helped promote more and more viticulture and more growing. In Yakima, so in that part of eastern Washington, you had Stonehouse Winery, which was the first official winery in Yakima in 1905, who made wine from Concord grapes, White Diamond, which was another Labrusca grape, Black Prince, which was a pretty popular grape back then, also known as Cinsault now, if you're familiar with southern France. And then some Zinfandel too. We had talked about Zinfandel a couple weeks back, and Zinfandel was planted back then, but with relative success based on where you were. And then 1910, there was the first Columbia River Valley Grape Carnival in Kennewick, so this is part of the Tri-Cities area in eastern Washington. So grapes were really starting to take hold. But again, most of these were table grapes or grapes for juice. And then in 1914, you had the arrival of William Bridgeman. And we'll learn a bit more about him next. That's why I highlighted his name a little bit, so you'll remember it. He started planting vines. He also planted Black Prince at a vineyard called Harrison Hill. This was in Sunnyside in Yakima Valley. And a few years later, he also planted on Snipes Mountain, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In 1917, the Washington legislature approved funding for an irrigation experiment station in Prosser, which was super important. It became part of the Washington State College system where they could do some agricultural research in irrigation and different plant life and what can grow well in eastern Washington. But then 1917 is also the year that the national legislature, so in Washington, D.C., they decided to start stripping away alcohol from the whole country, and Prohibition was already on its way. 1917 is when they actually approved it in the House and Senate. In 1918, and around that time, you had different states enacting Prohibition laws and whatnot at different times before it became official. Washington was one of those that enacted a bone-dry referendum to get rid of alcohol. And then the amendment was eventually ratified by the states in 1919 and then went into effect in 1920. So this was the whole national prohibition that went into effect January 17th. And I mentioned it before too, this stalled all production of wine on a commercial scale, but you were still able to sell grapes. So a lot of growers were selling grapes to home winemakers. There was a loophole in the law that said you could make up to 200 gallons of wine, or you could save fruit by fermenting it up to 200 gallons a year. So there was still a little bit of market or a little business for growers like Bridgeman to sell their grapes. And then after Prohibition, things started getting more exciting. We had St. Charles, which became the first bonded winery after repeal. And this was the same vineyard, the same place on Stretch Island that the Confederate soldier Lambert Evans planted his vines. So it was passed down to a nephew and another family. And they started St. Charles Winery in 1933. And then a big, I guess, legislative or economic event happened, which was the passing of the Steele Act. So in Washington, this is what established the State Liquor Board, or the Washington State Control Board, and made Washington, as well as many other states around the country, into control states. So all liquor, wine, and beer would be sold through state-controlled liquor stores. But what they did is the Steele Act, which was interesting, is they created a dual distribution model for wine. And so they separated domestic wine and foreign wine, which was really anything outside of Washington. So the main competitor they were worried about was California. They wanted to separate it to give a boost and really help their local wineries and local farmers out. So Washington wineries were able to sell their wine directly to wholesalers, directly to stores, whereas if someone from California or anything from out of the country or other parts of the US wanted to sell wines, they'd have to go through the Liquor Control Board. And that caused a lot of headaches. There was a lot more paperwork. It was just a harder process. So in a way, it was done in good faith to try to help a state economy in a time where they really wanted to focus on local wine. And we'll reference that in a minute. And then 2 years later, we had the emergence of Walter Clore. So this is who's now considered the father of Washington wine. He arrives from Oklahoma and comes to WSU, Washington State University, and he really is the one who helps guide many growers around the state with which varieties to grow where. He was a consultant for a lot of different growers. He ended up specializing in vinifera, but also hybrids and other varieties. And he was part of the reason why there was a boom that eventually, there was 42 wineries in Washington in just those few years after Prohibition. At the same time, taste had been changing in the country. So there was a move towards more fortified and sweet wines and boozy wines. And so in 1954, the American Wine Company was formed. You'll notice that both bolded, so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But they were focusing on sweetened fortified wines. 2 years later, in 1956, Otis Harlan planted Cabernet Sauvignon in what's known as Otis Vineyard now. These vines are still around, so these are the oldest cab vines in the States. And throughout the 60s, you saw more and more commercial scale plantings that the wine industry was gaining and was increasing to the point where it made a lot of sense to put more money into larger scale vineyards. In 1962, Associated Vintners Incorporated was formed by a group of faculty members from the University of Washington. And then the other pivotal part of, at least from a law economic standpoint, was the passing of California Wine Bill in 1969. So you'll notice that in 1969, there was only 8 wineries in Washington, whereas 30 years earlier, there was 42 wineries. Part of this was companies like the American Wine Company who would sort of take over smaller wineries and merge them into a larger scale. But a lot of it was the quality of wine was just not that great. A lot of wineries failed, and part of it is because there was no competition. So the Steele Act made it easier for wineries to sell their wines, and they didn't really have to worry about making them really good wines because they could sell all of it to all the local stores. It was an easy sell. But eventually you had California producers that really wanted to get their wine into the state. And so in 1969, the Washington legislature passed this bill, which allowed an influx of really good wine coming up from California. And at first you'd think that, oh man, this was really bad because it made the Washington wines look bad. But what it did is it actually encouraged them to get better and to make better wine and to adopt more modern techniques and to maybe look at what they were planting and where they were planting, and wine quality slowly got better and better from 1969 on. This is where I was saying earlier, I decided to stop the timeline, so to say, as far as Washington wine, because then we're going to get into some of the founding vineyards that are still around. And actually next week, we're going to be talking about Yakima Valley AVA specifically, and we'll be able to start right up from this point, because there's a lot of these vineyards like Red Willow Vineyard, Boucher, that will pop up in Yakima from some of these same people we're talking about today. So going back to these pioneers, William Bridgeman. So he was a Canadian, grew up on a family farm and conquered grapes on the Niagara Peninsula, but moved to Washington, and he was an attorney, and what he specialized in was irrigation and water rights. So if you remember that the turn of the century, there was a big push for irrigation in Eastern Washington to figure out the best ways to do that, the best policies. And he was instrumental in writing some of those laws that are still around today. But it also gave him a big interest in vines and in planting vineyards and seeing sort of the potential for wine grapes. So in 1914, he planted at Harrison Hill Vineyards, again, that Black Prince grape, the Senso. But then a couple years later, he also planted some Muscat of Alexandria, which is a vinifera variety, and then some Thompson seedless vines. And those vines are actually still around today. The next slide, you'll see a picture of one of them. So he was, a lot of people think he was in the right place at the wrong time, because right after this is when Prohibition hit. And it would have been amazing to see what he could have done and if he would have started making more vinifera wines, if he didn't have to worry about the next 13 years of Prohibition. So, but mainly he sold his grapes to immigrants, to Italian and Croatian immigrants making wine at home. And so that's a picture of one of his vines. That's a Thompson seedless vine from Upland Vineyard that's still around today. So over 100-year-old vine. So he continued to sell grapes during Prohibition, but obviously couldn't commercially produce wine. But then after repeal, he launched Upland Winery in 1934, which was the 13th bonded winery in Washington, but the first in Yakima Valley after Prohibition, and then continued planting more vinifera vines. So he started planting Chardonnay and Riesling. And then in the late 30s, this was the moment in Washington wine history where you almost saw the passing of the torch. He gave cuttings of some of his vines to the young vine enthusiast Walter Clare. So this is the Dr. Walter Clare that we'll talk about next at that Irrigation and Agriculture Research Center in Prosser. After a few more years, this again was when Americans wanted more sweet wines. There were a couple of really bad winters from 49 to 51 that destroyed a lot of vines. So a lot of his focus turned to dessert, fortified, and table grapes, just because that's where the market was. He didn't necessarily get a chance to really experiment with vinifera varieties as much as he wanted to. And then in 1960, he ended up selling Upland Winery and then died 8 years later. Luckily, though, Upland Winery is still around today. After he passed away, or after he sold it, it became a new winery. I think Santa Rosa Winery. They renamed it, but that folded in the early 70s. But it was bought by the Newhouse family. So the picture there is Todd Newhouse. He's the current vineyard manager of Upland Vineyard, which is actually one of the vineyards where we get some of our grapes here at Avennia too. So we are very lucky and fortunate to have them. And then Walter Clore. So, like I said, he came from Oklahoma and born in 1911. Walter Clore studied botany and agriculture, eventually getting a degree in horticulture from the school that would become Oklahoma State University. But he didn't move to Washington until he married Irene Welsh in 1934 and took a horticulture fellowship at the Washington State College. A few years later, he became the assistant horticulturist at that irrigation branch experiment station. And this is where he really got to play around and learn more and more about grapevines and about wine grape. So he oversaw experimental plantings of a bunch of different Labrusca varieties, vinifera varieties, many of which, again, were given by Bridgeman, and continued studying these and studied soil types and vineyard sites all over the state, and was really instrumental in letting people know where to grow what grapes. He also tested a lot of trellising systems, pruning systems, a lot of the more modern winemaking techniques that we know of today. He was the one who was spearheading that in a time where not a lot of people were focused on it. They were all focused on sweet wines. And so in just one of the, like I already mentioned, in 2001, the legislature officially recognized him as the father of the Washington wine industry. I think that would unofficially make Bridgeman the grandfather of the Washington wine industry. I don't know if it's an official title, but a lot of people think of Bridgeman in that way. And then we have the two companies, American Wine Growers and Associated Vintners. So American Wine Growers was formed from a couple different companies. So in 1933, you had Pomerel Company, which was primarily an apple apple juice company, and they started making some apple wine. And then Nawico, or National Wine Company, in 1934. They were both focused primarily on fruit wines and on fortified and dessert wines. Again, this is where most of the industry was going. And then they acquired Italian Winery in 1954 and then merged into the American Wine Growers, or American Wine Company. And they promoted fruit wine. And they started playing with some vinifera wines as well. And it wasn't until 1967 that legendary winemaker Andrei Chelychev, who was a Russian-born winemaker who became probably the most famous post-Prohibition winemaker in America. He came up from Napa and consulted with the American Wine Growers and with Walter Clore and discussed the potential for vinifera. And he was another sort of instrumental person in encouraging growers to focus on vinifera and really try to make more dry styles of wine, not just the sweet wines, not just fruit wines. And so they did. They ended up making a few vinifera varieties, and they changed their brand and began labeling those vinifera wines a few years later as Saint Michel. And so in 1972, they officially renamed the American Wine Growers into Saint Michel Vintners. And then that same vintage, the 1972 vintage of their white Riesling, ended up winning a huge blind tasting contest between Rieslings from Germany and California, similar to the Judgment of Paris. If you think about famous blind tasting competitions, this is another thing that put Washington on the map. And in sort of side note, in some ways it made the world think that Washington was just going to be a Riesling grower, that we should all plant Riesling because, you know, Washington is far north and Seattle is really cold and wet, so I bet Riesling would go well there. But that was a little premature before they realized the potential of the heat and the climate in Eastern Washington. But it was still a big deal. And it was only a few years after that, getting more notoriety and more famous, that they built the chateau at the Hollywood Farms in Woodinville. And that eventually became Chateau Saint Michel. And that's how we know it today. And I think Chateau Saint Michel is now the 7th largest winery in the country. It's definitely the largest producer in the state. And it's a big reason why the Washington wine industry today is what it is because of the work of Chateau Saint Michel. And it's officially known as the oldest winery in Washington. And then Associated Vintners. So going back again to 1950, this is a professor. He was a professor of psychology at UW and then eventually the dean of the School of Art and Sciences. But Lloyd Woodburn got interested in winemaking, and he had a couple other friends, some other professors at the school that he got to be interested in it as well. And he spent the next decade learning about winemaking, buying little parts and pieces and just experimenting at home. But they collectively would purchase grapes from different growers. At the time, they legally couldn't make wine together. They would still have to make it at home, but they could crush the wines together. So they could still purchase grapes. I forget where the actual warehouse where they did that first. It was in Kirkland, I believe, but I can look it up. And they crushed the grapes, then they would go off to their respective homes and make wine. But they got better and better. And one of the people that helped Woodburn was Bridgeman. So Bill Bridgeman, again, the Canadian, helped teach them about vinifera varieties. And so they got better at making these. Eventually in '61, they sent some sample bottles to Andrei Chelychev. So again, a very influential person, for feedback. And the feedback was good. He actually really loved their pale Grenache bubbler. So it was a slightly sparkling pale Grenache rosé. But they said it was an amazing wine, that they're going in the right direction. And so in 1962, they officially formed Associated Vintners. At that time, I think there was 10 different professors or 10 different vintners as part of this group. But they were also the first winery to solely focus on vinifera varieties, so on those European varieties that we all know. And then that same year, Bill Bridgman sold them the Harrison Hill land, so 5.5 acres on Harrison Hill to plant vines. So they were able to experiment for themselves. One of the professors, I forget his first name, his last name was Church, was a climatologist. So he was out in Eastern Washington and really studied, and he sort of helped guide what they were going to plant based on the climate and what they expected. So they experimented with a bunch of different wines. They had a lot of success with Gewürztraminer and Riesling. And that Gewürztraminer was one of the wines that in 1969, because they could sell directly to wholesalers, they sold to the QFC in University Village here, which is, for those of you not in Washington, it's a grocery store owned by Kroger now. But it got great reviews in the local paper, and it sold out in a week, and that really helped put them on the map. And so they started making more wine. People started loving it. That they hired a winemaker named David Lake. So he was another Canadian, a master of wine, who got on board and started making more wine, started focusing on more red wines, some Cabernet. Chelychev was able to taste his 79 and said it was one of the best Cabernets he ever tasted. So again, really starting to raise the prospect of Washington wine on a grander scale. And then because David Lake had sort of taken over and all these professors had gone into the background or were really managing the company from a side, they changed the name to Columbia Winery. So it was no longer an association of vintners. It was that sole vintner, that one winemaker, David Lake, who is calling all the shots now. So in '83, they changed to Columbia Winery. And if you're local and you know Chateau Saint Michel and Columbia Winery, these are two of the biggest, most important wineries that we have in Woodinville, especially. They're both now located basically across the street from each other in Woodinville. And so it's where a lot of great winemakers, Bob Betts worked for Chateau Saint Michel. A lot of winemakers came out of these two main companies, or these two main wineries. So then what happens? So if we look today, fast forward, Washington has over 1,000 wineries now, and we crush over 200,000 tons of grapes every year. I kind of skipped the 70s because we're going to talk about next week, but by the 1980s, there's 20 wineries. So again, remember 1969, there was 8 wineries at the time that California Wine Bill passed. It took a while to get up to 20. Took another 20 years to get to 74 wineries, and then in just 19 years, it just skyrocketed into over 1,000 different wineries in the state. We're now the second largest wine producing state behind California. We have 14 different appellations, so different American viticultural areas. And now we're seeing some new pioneers and some growers and winemakers that are continuing to push the boundaries. So this is where we get into just some of the the newer stuff going on. Now, this part could probably take another 2 weeks of explaining all the things that are going on in Washington now, but I just picked a couple of themes and a couple of wineries to point out for you. So one of the main trends right now, and how people are pushing boundaries, is having a more minimalist approach, and this whole idea of natural wine. You know, here at Avennia, we're not a natural winery. We don't. That's not part of our marketing or part of our explanation. We do have a minimalist approach, I would say, in that we're not, inoculating with yeast. We use native yeast. We're adding sulfur where we need to, but we're not doing a lot of other things to doctor up the wine. But there's people on the other side of the spectrum that are really hands-off, and two of those are Grow Grain and Devium. So Grow Grain is a relatively new winery in the scene, again, focusing on lighter, fresher styles of wine, but also on some less common varieties like Albarino and Lemberger, which is another name for that is Blaufränkisch, if you're familiar with Austrian wine. And then they're actually I'm really excited, they're in the process of planting Microbiome and Xarel-lo, which are two of the main grapes in cava production in Spain. And I think that might be some of the first those grapes have been grown in Washington. So they're growing some really interesting stuff. And then they're also one of the many wineries that are doing a pet nat. So this is the cutesy term for pétillant naturel, which is a naturally sparkling wine. What they basically do is take wine, and before it's done fermenting, they'll bottle it, they'll put a cap on it, and it finishes fermenting in bottle, and that's what creates the bubbles. So it's sort of a naturally fizzy wine, not as bubbly as champagne because it's a different process. But they make a pet nat from Lemberger. It's delicious. I tried it at Taste Washington 2 years ago. And so they're doing some really fun and exciting things. The other one, Devium Winery, is from Keith Johnson. He's the production winemaker at Sleight of Hand, a pretty well-known winery up here. He branched off and started Devium to focus on more natural wine approaches. So foot stomping, again, that spontaneous fermentation, minimal sulfur. He's on his website, he talks about, he aims for the do nothing fermentation, almost like the do nothing farming of Fukuoka, who's a very famous natural farmer from Japan. And he also is dealing with some really cool vineyards, one of which is Lewis Peak Vineyard. It's actually the highest elevation vineyard in the state, where he has Malbec, and I think it's grown at 3,000 feet. So this is almost twice as high as most other vineyards in the state. But so he gets a certain aspect, really crisp acidity from these wines. It's a place that actually gets enough rain that they can dry farm it, so they don't need to irrigate. It's one of the few places in Eastern Washington they can do that. So just really some really cool stuff coming from Keith over at Devium. And so that goes, segues into the other extreme viticulture. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Liminal and Weather Eye Vineyard. So for those of you that don't know, Liminal is a project that our winemaking team helped start. So Chris Peterson, our winemaker, and Marty Talker, our managing partner, teamed up with Ryan Johnson and Cam Mirvold to be in Liminal, which is a winery solely focused on Weather Eye Vineyard. Weather Eye is probably the most exciting vineyard that's been planted in the last 5 years. It's planted on the ridge of Red Mountain. So Red Mountain AVA is just a little hill, but the very top of the ridge is where Ryan Johnson spent 15 months intensely studying. But Ryan Johnson's been on Red Mountain for years at other wineries, so or other vineyards. He's spent a lot of time getting to know the hill, and he planted the vineyard in 2016, including some north-facing aspects. So he actually went outside of the boundary of the AVA and planted on the north side of the hill, and did all these cool head-trained Grenache and pole-trained Syrah, and a lot of different experimental plantings. Planted in 2016, we just released the new Liminal wines last year, and that was the 2018 vintage. And Sean Sullivan named Liminal the Winery of the Year last year, the Washington Winery of the Year. So it's a really exciting wine, but primarily because it's a really exciting spot. This is a very extreme place for viticulture in Washington. The other big name out there is Christophe Baron. So if you're familiar with Cayuse, or No Girls Wine, or Horsepower, or Category is another one of Christophe Baron's projects. He found this hill, he had been planting in the Rocks district and found this place that reminded him of Chateauneuf-du-Pape. And then he went up the river more towards the North Fork, where the North Fork and the Walla Walla River meets, and found really steep hillsides that reminded him more of the Northern Rhone and more of Hermitage or Côte Rôtie. So he planted some really densely planted Poltrain Syrah on super steep, almost 60-degree gradient slopes in 2011. And these are some of the highest scoring wines every year now. It's a very, very elegant, super powerful Syrah, and just a super cool site. I'll have a picture of it in a minute. And then one of my favorite producers here, because I've mentioned it before, I really like some of those Loire Valley style wines, those lighter, more elegant, graceful, and really lighter alcohol wines. And Savage Grace is one of my favorites here, but a lot of people are keeping an eye on Michael Savage. So he's located in Woodinville, but sources from all over Washington, but a lot from Columbia Gorge. So this is down in southern Washington, over the Columbia River from Oregon. The AVA actually is partly in Oregon, so it straddles the river. But he loves Loire Valley wines as well, and has decided to focus a lot of his wines on Cabernet Franc, like the Loire Valley. So he has 4 different vineyard designates of Cab Franc. He actually makes a Blanc Franc, which is when you make a white wine from red grapes. So he presses the grapes immediately, takes the skins away so you don't get any of the color, and you make almost a pale, it's a very, very pale rosé, whitish color wine from Cab Franc. He makes a cru carbonic, so this is using whole berry fermentation or carbonic maceration, which we've talked about before. And then he also makes a pet nat. So again, he's taking a more minimal approach, the more natural wine side of things, still uses some sulfur to protect the wines, but just doing some really cool things. And he's also now recently acquired Underwood Mountain Vineyard in Columbia Gorge, which is one of the coolest sites in Washington. So he had been getting Gruner Veltliner from that vineyard for a while, and now Pinot Noir, some Chardonnay, Pinot Gris. There's going to be some really cool climate grapes coming from that vineyard as well. And this is a picture of maybe just a highlight of some of those. So the upper left is Liminal. So this is the canyon block at the top of Red Mountain. Below that, you have Christophe Baron with his hands on his hips on the Orcata Gris. You can see there how steep that hill is, that 60-degree gradient, and also how densely planted those vines are, which is just amazing. And then there's Michael Savage on the lower right, carrying the buckets, doing his thing. And then there's the Grosgrain Pet Nat label from Grosgrain Winery. And that's it. You'll see that there's the picture right there, and the very first picture is of Red Willow Vineyard. It's more of a sneak peek, so to say, because we'll talk more about Red Willow next week when we get into Yakima Valley. But that is our Washington wine pioneers, who, at least when I was looking back and learning about, I'm like, oh yeah, these were really important things that happened in Washington wine history. So yeah, and at this point, obviously, is the time for questions if you're interested. There's a chat box. Oh, there's 16 AVAs now. Thank you, Pat. That's actually great. I think I got that from, I was looking at a Washington Wine Commission PDF, and it was something old, and I didn't even think to fact check that. So thank you. And yeah, so and I'll figure out which ones I'm missing, because I know the Lewis Clark AVA, which is partly in Idaho and partly in Washington, is one of the newer ones I might have missed. But yeah, was there any questions about some of this history, or what wine? Mary Margaret's asking Donna in the chat, what wine did you hold up? Oh, you were drinking Savage Grace?
Yeah. Cab Franc.
Cab Franc. Yeah.
Which Cab Franc? Which vineyard?
The 2 blondes.
Yep. Okay. Oh, that's great. And that's a vineyard that Andrew Will Winery also works with a lot. And Andrew Will's another just fantastic winery. But oh, good. Well, good timing.
Yeah, we really like his wines. They're very unique for Washington.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, Pat, thank you. Yeah, Candy Mountain and Royal Slope. That's right. I remember reading about this. Are the newest AVAs. Yeah, Royal Slope, and that's a big one. I've seen Royal Slope on labels before, even though before it could officially be called an AVA. So I know that's been a really popular spot. So, oh yeah, here there's a question. I'll get you to unmute real quick.
Okay,
A very unimportant question, but where is Stretch Island?
Stretch Island. It's a very important question. So Stretch Island it's in Puget Sound, but it's the southern end of Puget Sound. So actually, my wife and I were just in Olympia this past weekend, and if you were in Olympia and you drove north, I don't know, about 30 minutes, it's just northeast of Olympia. For those of you that know Shelton, maybe it's directly east. Sorry, northwest of Olympia, directly east of Shelton, but in the lower part of Puget Sound.
Okay.
In Puget Sound, which is the funny part, because Puget Sound's not necessarily known for wine now. There is an AVA and some winemakers making some cool wines in Puget Sound, but back then, I mean, that's just where this guy ended up and planted some of the first vines.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, any other questions? I know I'd always get carried away with history just because I get fascinated when everything starts getting tied together and it's just insane. Yeah, Mary Margaret.
There is a question in the chat, but I'm going to hop the line since I'm unmuted. It's interesting to me as you were talking how different laws governing, like, you can do this, but you can't do that. You can, have affected how the wine has been made over time. How much do you feel constrained by laws kind of governing what you can do and not do at this point? And are there things that you'd like to see change about some of those regulations?
That's a good question. Luckily, I think America overall is pretty lax with wine laws, and it's helped winemakers and growers be pretty adventurous and experimental in what they're doing. So I don't know if there's going to be more laws like the ones we saw in the early 20th century as far as dictating what people can and cannot make or grow, which I think is great. And I think that's what makes the American winemaking spirit what it is. Because if you contrast it with European Union and France and Italy and some of these other places where it's very particular. I mean, if there's appellations where you're not allowed to grow a certain amount of, the planting density has to be a very specific amount, or you can't have yields above a certain amount of tons per acre. There's so many more laws, or about sugar levels, or what grapes you can or cannot plant in certain areas. And I'm really glad that we don't have that in Washington. I think, the second part of your question, I just lost it. Basically, I think that there's not going to be, that's what I was going to say. The other great thing, especially about Washington, is land pricing. And like when you contrast it with Napa or Northern California, the fact that land prices in Washington are still relatively affordable, it helps growers be able to take more risks. So, thinking about grow grain or people that are going to decide, I'm going to plant Chirello and Ribolla Gialla and all these grapes that might not do well at all, and there might not be a big market for them. It's not like they're going to lose a lot of money by trying it out. Whereas if you're in Napa and you want to try planting Vermentino or something, it has to be the best wine in the world, and you have to market it so well that you could sell it for a certain amount of money just to pay off how much the land is. And so I think it's even easier in Washington to be able to do some of those things because land prices are a little lower. Yeah. Yeah, Peter, and then I'll answer Casey's question. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. Did the demise of the state stores have any appreciable impact on the wine industry?
That's a good question, and I think because was it 2010 when
I think so.
Finally ended, or 2010, but then 2011 was when it started or was enacted. I have to look into that because I just missed that. That happened right before I moved to Seattle. We moved here in 2013, and I remember people talking about like, oh, you should have seen what it was like when we were still a control state, and so I'm not really sure of how much the market changed or the industry changed, but I'll look into that and I'll put it in the fact check sheet because I'm interested to know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So Casey's in the chat asks, what's the state of Riesling in Washington nowadays? It started as a signature wine, and now what? Don't see too much outside of Saint Michel. That's a good question. You know, Riesling. There's still a lot of producers that are making Riesling from different parts of the state. You have, you know, Evergreen Vineyard in Ancient Lakes, AVA, which I believe that's where the Kung Fu Girl Riesling is grown. That's one of Charles Smith's wines. I actually think that's the largest single vineyard wine in the world. I heard that once. I don't know if that's still true, but as far as the amount of quantity of Riesling they get from one vineyard and bottle it, that's the largest single vineyard wine in the world. So there's a lot of Riesling. Eroica, which is the top Riesling from Chateau Saint Michel, and it's a partnership with Dr. Lozen, so a Mosel producer, or Ernst Lozen. That's another super famous wine. It's not super expensive, but year after year is still a benchmark as far as Riesling, domestic Riesling. And there's a lot of producers that are still making it. I know Sparkman makes a really nice Riesling called Birdie. Devium is looking at some Riesling on Lewis Peak Mountain. So I'm not sure. It's, Riesling is still, as far as the general market, there's still some confusion on whether it's dry or whether it's sweet. There's still a lot of people that will just assume Riesling is a sweet wine. And partially because some great Rieslings from Germany were sweet, but most German Riesling is dry as well. So that's another sort of marketing confusion that still needs some attention, I think. I personally love Riesling because Savage Grace has a beautiful Riesling. Tempest makes a great Riesling. There was lots of different Rieslings I've had from Washington recently. But that's not. I'll do a little more deep dive into Riesling as well and try to figure that out. Robin asked, do they still have experimental stations? Do any of the universities have programs and or provide interns? So yeah, I believe that the irrigation experiment station in Prosser is still active, but WSU, Washington State University, has probably one of the best agriculture or best viticulture and enology programs in the world. So they're continuously doing a lot of research and just doing some cutting edge climate science, soil science, and learning more and more. I'll look up more like the specifics because I'm not sure like what the exact name of that program is, but actually our cellar master now, Jared, spent time at WSU going through that program and is super, super knowledgeable. So they're doing something right. That's for sure. But yeah, there's programs. There's also experimental vineyards, and that's also might be what you're asking too. I know that there's different vineyards where they're experimenting with different rootstocks and different clones, and there's constantly research done on a vineyard level like that with experimental vineyards across the state. So, yeah, Peter.
Your comments have just sparked another question. Has it ever been considered to, in the laboratory, so to speak, create a perfect soil and then deliver it to what they consider to be an ideal location, for the sun and temperature, et cetera?
That's a great question. It sounds like it would make sense. Yeah, I think, I know that there's places in the world that have added things to their soil, or at least, when you're clearing land for a vineyard anyway, you might be bringing in topsoil or other things to level off the area. So that I know there's things like that. There's also different like if you need to balance pH in soil, you can sprinkle other the soil. So I know that people are doing that, but you're right. I mean, I'm sure there is a way to find out, I want to plant, like, this site is perfectly situated for Merlot because of this and this, but the soil's not right. So let's add some more clay. Yeah, maybe there's people doing that. That's fascinating to think about. Oh, yeah. Right. Mark Robin, you have a comment? You're muted now, though. There you go.
But remember, some of the most important part of the soil is the mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria, and that would be really hard to create in a lab.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Our resident microbiologist here reminds me. No, you're right. And not only that, but the amounts, like how much subsoil too is important in vine health and in bringing nutrients and water up from where they need it. That's super interesting. Yeah, it'll be
Many of the microbes still cannot be grown in the laboratory that
really
are involved in soil chemistry. So it's impossible to grow them and utilize them in agriculture. We know they're there by DNA work, but we don't know how to grow them and distribute them.
really that's fascinating. Huh. Well, I mean, thanks for the fact check in the moment, and I'll I'll look and double check. Oh, that's funny. That's great. Yeah, it is interesting. The more and more science figures out about the wine industry, I think the more questions like that are going to arise. I know on the other side of the spectrum, there's people now that think they can recreate a wine based on science alone. So they would open up, a 1980 bottle of Bordeaux or something, and they could analyze exactly what makes it up as far as the chemical compounds, the water content, alcohol, sugar, the exact kind of tannins, and that they think now they could recreate it in a lab to taste the exact same. So, I mean, I think that sounds terrifying, and I don't know if I'd want to try that wine because it kind of ruins the art to me. But it's also fascinating that science is progressing to a point where we can measure more things like that more and more, and figure that out. So.
You can drink that with the meat that's grown in a
Yeah.
lab.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Right. That's all things Avennia 2050. Yep. Well, that's great. Well, if any of you, if there's no more questions, I'll wrap things up here. I definitely have my homework. I'm going to research some of these things because that's really cool. Some fascinating stuff. The last thing I was going to do before we signed off is let you know about the next 2 months. So we scheduled out the next 2 months of topics for all things Avennia, and I wanted to give you the first sneak peek of those weeks. We haven't officially posted yet. I'm hoping to do it tomorrow because I'm still waiting for a final confirmation from someone who might be joining us to do one of the weeks. But I did want to give you the first. Nope, that's the wrong button. I wanted to give you the first taste of it. So, and I've already mentioned some of this before because in the last week when we had mentioned a certain topic, and I was like, oh yeah, we're going to talk about that. So on the very first Thursday in April, so on April 1st, it's actually April 1st, April Fool's Day, that Thursday we're going to do wine fraud. So it's going to be a short history of wine fraud and then a review / discussion of the documentary Sour Grapes. So that's another one. If you want the homework of watching that movie before we join, go ahead and do that. I still haven't seen it. I'm going to watch it fresh. So it's fresh for me. And we'll be able to talk about that, but also in the larger context of wine fraud. On April 8th, the following week, we're going to do sparkling wine of the world. So everything from Champagne, Prosecco, Franciacorta to Cap Classique and Blanquette de Limoux and Bougie Cerdon. So many different kinds of sparkling wines. We'll go into some of the winemaking techniques, but also where a lot of these sparkling wines are coming from. On April 15th, the next Thursday, I'll actually be joined by Marty Talker. So he's our managing partner and co-founder of Avennia. He's going to join, and we're going to be able to chat with him about what it's like to transition from the tech world. He was with Microsoft for a long time and transition into the wine industry. But also we'll open up a library wine. I'm going to let him pick what his favorite wine of the last 10 years that Chris has made is, and we'll open up a bottle and talk about that as well. And then the next week is Earth Day on April 22nd. So we're going to do climate change, and I'll go over, how climate change is affecting the wine world in general and here in Washington, and what steps are being taken to mitigate that. And then I'm super excited. The week after that is April 29th, and that'll be 2 days before our summer release. So we release our new white wines, the Olian, Sauv Blanc, and Le Pearl, Roussan Marsan, and then our Rosé on May 1st. And so Thursday the 29th, I'm going to be joined by my good friend Chris Horn. He was my old boss and a sommelier and a wine and food pairing savant. And we're going to talk about food and wine pairing. He coined the term mind mouth, and he's the one who wrote the book Cook and Cork, which some of you might own because I think I got it for you. And then we'll talk specifically about white wine pairing and what would pair well with the Olean, the La Perle, and the Rosé. The next week is what I'm still waiting to hear back from. We're gonna focus on women in the wine industry, and I'm waiting to hear back from someone who can be a guest host with me, so that we could talk more about the progress and seeing more and more women winemakers and growers and how that's going. And then May 13th is when we're going to be joined by Lacey Liebeck. So she is the vineyard manager at Sagemore Farms. So this is where we get fruit from Dionysus Vineyard, Bacchus Vineyard, and she's going to join and give an update on what's happening in the vineyard. So this will be another viniculture discussion, but she's actually going to be the expert who can answer all the questions that I don't know the answers of. And she's also going to share some pictures of the vineyard and what's happening now. So, or in May at that time, this will be, flowering and suckering and some of that time where they're really going to be able to start seeing the vineyard take shape. So that'll be exciting. The next Thursday, May 20th, we're going to do New Varietal Support Group 2.0. So that's going to be another new varietal time to grab another wine that you've never tried, and we'll do that together. And then the last Thursday in May, May 27th, is Rosé Day. So my hope is that it'll be really nice weather. I might try to do it from outside if I can, but we'll look at how rosé is made. It's actually a trickier process than you think, and then where some of the great rosés from the world come from. So that's what's coming up. That's what's on the docket. Like I said, we'll post it tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow, if I can nail down the rest of the details, so you can check back. But yeah, that's what's in store. So with that, I just want to thank you all again for joining and for geeking out on some Washington wine history. Hopefully I'll see you again next week, talk about Yakima, and if you wanted to unmute to say goodbye, now would be your time. So
Thanks, Eli.
Thanks, Eli.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you.
We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.